Hello students. In today's video lecture, we're going to be talking about the basics of the brain. So the brain is such an interesting organ. Structurally, it doesn't really look that interesting. That's why you always see it colored like this. But I want to show you some actual images of a real human brain. So this has obviously been removed. Here's a gloved hand and a non-gloved hand. And this is a brain that has been cut a little bit, and you can see there's a piece of it that's been removed here, and we'll talk about what's going on there. But the blood supply, all these dark lines are blood vessels, and there's actually a little covering right over the surface of the brain that we'll talk about in another lecture. Here's an image that shows a frontal plane through the brain, cut the front off, so we can see it definitely has this two different colored areas, and there's actually some gaps in the brain tissue. And then a couple of more examples of brains. This is from a monkey. There's a mouse right there. And then this is the comparison between a newborn human and an adult human. Now, these look a little different because they've been preserved. So you see how they're kind of tannish or more white colored, whereas the fresh brain is much more pink in color. But there's definitely still a color change, which we will discuss. Right, let's get into it. The brain is actually divided into 4 major regions, and those 4 regions I'm going to go ahead and highlight because it'll take us a little bit to get through all of them. So the first main region is the cerebrum, and that is this huge wrinkly part right here. It's what everybody notices as the brain. That's just, it's super recognizable. So we've got a part called the cerebrum. The next part called the cerebellum. So these are two, look at how similar the words are, but they're actually 2 separate parts. Cerebrum has its own stuff going on. The cerebellum is this little mini brain underneath, and usually it shows wrinkles as well. So we've got the cerebrum and the cerebellum as as 2 parts on the first page. And on the second page, notice it jumps to number 3. We're in the inner part of the brain now, called the diencephalon. Di means 2, N is within or inside, cephalo is head, so 2 within the head. And then the last part, number 4, is the brain stem. And it is much like a stem. Before we get to the spinal cord, it's this part right here. So we'll talk about each individual little piece as we go through. So let's jump back to our cerebrum. Now, the cerebrum is all this stuff up here, number 1. Notice in your diagram it's 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, and then over here by itself, 1E. All that is cerebrum. So all this part right here of the notes applies to the cerebrum only. It's the largest part of the brain, and it is very wrinkled in appearance. And actually, the wrinkles are a great thing because the more wrinkles your brain has, the more surface area your brain has. So compare an adult rhesus monkey and the amount of wrinkles to an adult human and the amount of wrinkles. We have more than the monkey. And compare the mid-gestation human, that means like before it's born, halfway through the pregnancy, compare that to a newborn and see how the wrinkles are forming. So wrinkles means surface area, and surface area means more neurons. That's good. So we're talking about the big wrinkled area, the cerebrum. Now, if we look at the very surface of the brain, and I'm going to change pictures here, the very surface of the brain is a little bit different. See how it's pink at the edge and then white on the inside. And you can see the same here. It's a different color on the surface than it is on the inside. Well, that surface area that covers the entire surface of the brain, even deep into the wrinkles, is called the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the outermost portion of the brain, the most superficial portion. Now, that's the part of the brain where the cell bodies are and the dendrites are. And we know in terms of neuron structure, those parts of the neuron do not have a myelin sheath. The axon's the only part that has the myelin sheath. And so they have a gray appearance. So I'm going to grab this gray color and highlight right here. The cerebral cortex has a gray appearance. Now, I don't, you might not agree with gray. Here, it's legitimately pink. And here it's a darker gray. In a more preserved brain, it looks a little bit more brownish, but they call it gray. And for that reason, we say that the cerebral cortex is made of a type of nervous tissue, a variation of nervous tissue called gray matter. So gray matter without the myelin sheath is on the outside of the very surface of the brain. Now, if we look inside that, see that it's not gray, it's more white. And again, on this diagram, see how it's lighter colored on the inside of the brain. That's deeper. So those are the parts of the neuron that do have the myelin sheath. So in the notes, deeper to this gray matter, the neuron parts are myelinated. The presence of the myelin sheath causes the brain tissue to be white in color. For this reason, the internal parts of the brain are made of a type of nervous tissue called white matter. And you can tell that apart really simple. This is the white matter in here. This is where the myelin sheath is. And this is the gray matter at the outside. So if I was going to draw on top of this brain with my amazing artistic ability, I would draw, let's go deep into this wrinkle. I would draw a little cell body here with my dendrites. Perfect replica. And my axon with the myelin sheath would extend inward like this. So this is my myelin sheath area. Now, of course, there's not just one neuron, okay? Cell bodies are all out through here. And then the axons all reach in like this. Okay, so that's what gives you the heavy appearance of that myelin there. Okay, so we've got gray matter and we got white matter. All right, the cerebrum is divided into two halves. So we're looking at a side view here, but if we go back to our top view, you'll notice this is the front over here on this side, and this is the back of the brain. You'll notice that it's pretty much divided in half, where the two sides look, aside from this cut area, relatively the same. So those are called hemispheres. There's two hemispheres to the cerebrum. We have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. So we'll put in the notes, the cerebrum is divided into two equal left and right halves called hemispheres. Now, perhaps you have heard this before. The left hemisphere is associated with logic, science, math, organizing, analyzing, rationale. The left hemisphere of the brain is associated more with logical processes, while the right hemisphere is associated with creativity. So it's been talked about quite a bit in the past that humans generally have a dominant hemisphere. But in my opinion, most people use both the left and the right. But you may have one. Maybe you're really super into art or music or theater, and that's just, your creative space and you love to be in that place. Perhaps you're a right hemisphere dominant individual. If you love math and science and organizing and, everything has its place, then perhaps you're a left hemisphere dominant individual. Between those two hemispheres is a deep groove. And if we could put pressure on this and just sort of separate these two hemispheres in either direction, we would be able to sort of spread them apart. So pull this one this way, pull this one this way. We'll notice there's this long groove in between them. That groove is called the longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal fissure. Longitudinal means like long ways, long direction, and a fissure is a crack or a cleft. So it's literally like a deep crack between the two hemispheres. Now, if we were to spread those open, what we'd see inside is the connection between the two. And that connection is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum. This allows the two hemispheres to communicate. And I am going to highlight that because allowing your two hemispheres to communicate is very important. And I'm going to show you some images of the corpus callosum. What does that mean? Allowing the two hemispheres to communicate. When you go to catch a ball, your right hand and your left hand work together in a coordinated way. That's because the information is going between the two hemispheres to allow you to do things together with both sides of your body. So if we look at this picture here, we can see the corpus callosum is right here. And I know this is a little bit of a strange view, but we've cut the front off and we can see this connection right here. Now, you have to imagine that this is like a bridge between the two hemispheres. And it extends out of the screen at you and into the screen at you and runs like almost the whole length of the longitudinal fissure, but down at the bottom of it. So see right here, this crack is the longitudinal fissure, and at the bottom of that is the corpus callosum. Let me give you another image. So check this out. I've got the nervous system highlighted in the anatomy app. All of what we're seeing here is the cerebrum. And then you can see why they call this little brain back here. That looks like a little mini version. That's the cerebellum. So let's look at the longitudinal fissure. See this groove between the two hemispheres. And see there's a white structure way down deep in the middle of that groove. So if I delete, it's going to delete the whole hemisphere. Here's the corpus callosum, and I want you to get a view of that. See how it's like a bridge between the two sides, and it stretches. If I get rid of this, and I have the corpus callosum highlighted, you can get the idea that it kind of connects the two hemispheres on either side. Okay, here is a top view, superior view of the brain. The front is here, and back is here. Okay, right side, right hemisphere, left hemisphere. Here's the longitudinal fissure. Part of the brain has been removed right here. And look, here's the bridge. This is the corpus callosum. So it's going to stretch from here to about here, and then same on the other side. And they've drawn in. Now, you won't be able to see this if you look. But all these little lines are representing the axons coming in from this side and this side. And they're going to be able to communicate. There's communication zone there. Now, perhaps you've heard the right hemisphere controls the left side of your body and vice versa. That's actually true. It just has to do with the way the motor neurons stretch down from the brain. From the right side, they actually cross over in the spinal cord and go to the left side of the body, and then vice versa. So that is true. And it's the cerebrum, remember we're talking about all of this wrinkled part here, that is in charge of or responsible for the higher thinking, reasoning, and planning skills that are attributed to humans. We can make long-range plans. We can have rationale and maturity. That's coming from the cerebrum. We have the most advanced brain that we know of in the animal kingdom. Okay, so I have added color and names to each of these 1A through 1E, and they correspond to this picture up here. So my 1A that's blue is called the frontal lobe. These are named for the cranial bones. 1B is green, temporal lobe. 1C is the red, that's the parietal lobe. 1D, occipital lobe. And 1E, way over here by itself, I'll show you a real picture of it in just a second, the insula. So all these are the parts of the cerebrum. The whole thing's called cerebrum, and then they're divided into lobes or sections, regions. So now that we have them named and colored in so we can tell the difference, let's talk about what their jobs are. And this is going to be super basic. The frontal lobe is the largest lobe of the brain, and it controls a lot of important aspects. It controls our voluntary muscles, like what I'm using right now to type, my skeletal muscles. It controls our speech. A lot of times if people have had a stroke, which is blood supply has been restricted to part of the brain, you can tell if it's in the frontal lobe because they'll have paralysis on one half of their body or having trouble speaking, formulating the speech. And you can tell if their left side is paralyzed, the stroke was in the right frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe also controls stuff like maturity, planning, reasoning. And as you get older, you'll become more mature. You will actually start to use your frontal lobe, the neurons in your frontal lobe, to make more of your decisions. And it's estimated that the frontal lobe is not fully mature, adult brain-wise, until about the age of 25. So younger people tend to use less of their frontal lobe when they're making decisions and more of the emotional center of the brain called the amygdala. We'll learn about that later. All right, the temporal lobe is here by the ear, and that's controlling your ability to understand what you're hearing. So I'm going to put sense of hearing. Do you understand the words that I'm saying? What if I was speaking Chinese? Perhaps you would not be understanding it. You could hear it, which is your temporal lobe, but you are not able to understand it, which is also temporal lobe. The parietal lobe deals mainly with your senses of touch and taste, and whether or not you like broccoli or asparagus or the taste of black licorice, or perhaps you do not like your feet touched. So it allows you to feel those sensations, be aware of those sensations, and then also kind of has that role in deciding whether you like that or not. The occipital lobe, all the way in the back, is in charge of your vision. Very, very important. Almost every aspect of vision is taking place way back here. So notice our eyes would be up here by the frontal lobe, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the information from our eyes goes to the nearest lobe of the brain. It just happens to be how we're wired. And then the last lobe of the cerebrum, let me show you a different image of it. 1E, and you'll see here it's colored green. I've colored mine pink on the original notes. So 1E, I'm going to add that in. Notice, how did we get to this spot called the insula? They used these little metal retractors and separated out the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. There's a deep groove here called the lateral sulcus, and underneath is hiding the insula. Incidentally, this is the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe back here, and this little guy, we haven't talked too much about him, is the cerebellum. So keep in mind, all the rest of this is the cerebrum, frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, and insula, which is 1E on our notes. The insula is a not very well-known part of the brain. A lot of places will just show you the 4 lobes, and the insula is responsible for perceiving our internal sensations. Also has to do with cravings and addiction. So in terms of the cerebrum, most of our thought processes are happening up here in the frontal lobe. The rest of this is sort of making sense of our world. All of this is the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. Let's go ahead and learn a little bit about the cerebellum. Now, the cerebellum is actually a bit more wrinkled than what we see here. So let me pull up my anatomy app and I'll show you. So here we are in the anatomy app, and we can clearly see the cerebrum. I don't know if it'll divide it into lobes for me. Frontal lobe. This is good boundaries. There's the parietal lobe, all of that. This was the frontal, all of this. Temporal lobe here, and occipital lobe in the back. Now this is the cerebellum, and under here, lots of parts. And then you can see it's also divided into 2 halves. But if I unhighlight it, you can see it has all these little mini wrinkles, much like a very small version of the cerebrum. So in our notes, the cerebellum, the name means little brain. It is also highly wrinkled in appearance and divided into 2 hemispheres, just like the cerebrum. Now, the cerebellum controls our balance, our physical coordination, and motor memory. And motor memory and coordination and balance, they all kind of go together. So I want you to imagine riding a bicycle when you learned how to ride a bicycle. I'm going to put that as an example. Or something that takes a moderate amount of coordination, tying a shoe. Your right hand and your left hand, your right leg and your left leg, whatever it happens to be doing, have to work together. And it's a sequence of events that you learn and you remember. So at this point in your life, you can tie a shoe without even thinking about it. You can write your name without even thinking about it. But back in preschool and kindergarten, that was a big deal, learning how to ride a bicycle and learning how to tie your shoe and write your letters correctly. So all of that is taking place in that little place at the back of the brain that we call the cerebellum. And that's always going to be all the way in the back underneath the occipital lobe. Coming up next are the internal parts of the brain.